And as my teacher Geshe Sopa often says, when he gives teachings, I mentioned this once before, he often says, during this course we're going to chew some tough bones. Usually we want material that's quite easy, like pablum, right? Something easy to chew and swallow. When you're kids, you don't have any teeth, or when you're very old. And this may require of you a little bit of mental effort, but I think there'd be great benefit from that. One of the reasons for engaging in a study like this is to develop your wisdom. It's not just to accumulate a lot of facts, be worried about whether you've memorized things, although memorization is useful too. But basically, this kind of study helps to develop your wisdom and to develop vocabulary that we'll be using as we study about other subjects, selflessness, emptiness, if we study other texts. I bet we don't need so much volume on here, do we? What do you think? Okay. Otherwise, we might get a little feedback. Can you hear me still? Pretty well, everyone? Okay, good. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Let's begin, as we try to do all the time, with a good motivation. Maybe over the weeks as we progress, we'll do some prayers also, and requesting prayers to Manjushri or something like that. But right now, let's try to quiet our minds. And one of the best ways to do that is through meditation. Sit comfortably, relax your body, relax your mind. Even from the very beginning, trying to have some kind of union of very special motivation that you're doing this for our ultimate attainment of enlightenment, and out of a wisdom that understands that really there are no problems to worry about. There's nothing that you have to attend to, that might be attractive in your mind, or worries. All of those things that we designate with so much value and importance are ultimately empty. Whatever understanding you have right from the start, to try to recall that, and begin by placing your attention on the breathing. With each breath, breathing out your tension, your worries, breathing in inspiration, and watching very carefully, knowing that you're breathing in, knowing when you're breathing out, and watching the endpoints, particularly where your mind may begin to try to play and engage other thoughts when the breath is not moving so rapidly. And follow one breath down to your heart. Let your attention stay there, away from the cerebral region. Just let your mind watch itself. Either you can think one corner of the mind, watching the contents of the rest of the mind, or one instant of mind being aware of what's just occurred the previous instant in the mind. Here the exercise is not merely to watch all the varied thoughts that pass through your mind, the various emotions that might arise, or to be aware simply of the feelings. But amongst that variety of phenomena, to see some commonality, that they're all arising within the nature of the mind, which is clear and knowing, like a vast space that allows their presence, and to focus on it as your object, thereby taking your attention away from the thoughts, the thought processes, allowing them to subside, to disappear. The nature of the mind, as we'll learn, is said to be clear and knowing. See if you can imagine bringing your attention to your heart, as though withdrawing your attention to the senses, like a tortoise withdrawing its limbs inward. The mind itself has no color or shape or dimension. So any blackness that you may see is perhaps induced by your eye consciousness if your eyes are slightly shut. That's not the nature of the mental consciousness. Try to get a feeling for the fact that that is there depends upon the mind's spaciousness, its clarity. Try to develop a mental image of that through your experience. The continuity of clarity and knowing that we call the conventional nature of the mind. See if you can let go of your attachment to, your attention to the form of your body that seems to be looming there irrefutably. That too is arising in your mind as an object, mental picture, through the sense consciousness perhaps. Let go of that. Try to refocus on the spaciousness of the mind within which that sense of the body was previously embedded, in which it was arising. There's space. There's space for all these thoughts. Even the sense of an observer, in a sense dualistically observing, relishing the meditation. That too is just a thought. Vast, crystal clear spaciousness of the mind, once our mind is quieted, like the appearance of the sky at dawn after the rain season. Even the dust has been cleansed from the sky before the vibration of the sun fills the sky, as though you could see forever. Clear light. And thinking of all other living beings who have been intimately related with us numberless times in the past. The vast womb of time. We don't recognize them now as close acquaintances, as mothers, but that doesn't mean that they were not. They've been depthlessly kind to us, just as our present mother has been depthlessly kind to us over numberless lifetimes. Knowing a little bit about the nature of cyclic existence. We can develop some sense of renunciation for ourselves, not to be overcome by its attractions, not to be depressed by the inevitable rising of karmic suffering, all of it changing. On the basis of that, we can develop some sense of identity, empathy for others, and a sense of compassion based on our feeling indebted to them. just as we wish to be free of suffering, so do all living beings. Just as we want to be happy, everything go right, so everyone. The best that we can do now is perhaps not even lead ourselves, let alone lead others out of this suffering. So for their welfare, try to make a special motivation here at the beginning of the course. I'm going to be engaging in this activity as the great lamas, masters, meditators, yogis, yoginis of the past have done, this kind of study to sharpen our minds, to understand better the laboratory of our mind, the playground, the field of our consciousness. To develop our wisdom so that we can eliminate from our mind all the harmful elements, develop the good qualities, especially wisdom, compassion, to become Buddhas, enlightened, so that those living beings that depend upon us can quickly be let out of their suffering. So not just as a scholastic exercise or to get some accreditation, but for the welfare of others, I'm going to listen to, participate in the course tonight and throughout all of my lifetimes, study for the purpose to get closer to Buddhahood for the welfare of all beings. And then relax. Bring your attention back to the present. Hey, cool. Do we have a text for this, gentleman? Do you have did you get one of these texts? No. Okay. So how's everyone? How was your meditation? No takers.
Talk about sky dancers.
Mm.
How would you say in Tibetan, cloud follower?
Cloud follower. I don't know. Never heard cloud follower. But you know the word, you've heard of dakas and dakinis, no? You know what a daka is? Do you know, Venerable, what dakini is?
Dakini is someone who visualizes emptiness.
Maybe realizing it, maybe not. I don't know. It might be, not necessarily, but perhaps, depends. Dakini means, as the Tibetans in their the great meditators of the past, the way that they translated the term from Sanskrit, they translated it as khandro. Ka means sky or space. Droa means to go or travel. So on one level, it could be those beings that traverse through the space of non-conceptual wisdom. You know, in a sense, maybe directly realizing, or even as we're doing now, letting go of the ego, diving into the mind, letting go and trying to experience that clear light nature. Be a real daka, be a real dakini. Don't be a cloud follower. You maybe see in the tankas sometimes some pictures of daka and dakinis in the corner, sort of flying through the sky. You ever seen? So it's sort of that flavor, I think. Okay, So perhaps as we do some more of this meditation, you'll have some questions or observations about it. But we're going to begin studying this particular text that most of you, I think all of you have before you, no? You have?
I have.
Yeah. Yeah. And this particular text was chosen again by our teachers as, in fact, this is the text that was studied by almost everyone in our tradition, in the Gelugpa tradition, when they were kind of growing up, so to speak. When I was a kid, did you ever hear that? We had to do this or that. So this is one of the first subjects that's studied in the monasteries, and I think also in the nunneries, those that are preparing to be able to study the great texts. I think it might seem some of the matter of it might seem more complicated than others. Some of the material might be more simple. This is called, as you see from the title here, Explanation of the Presentation of Objects and Subjects. They call object possessors, because a subject is something that possesses an object. So we could just you could cross that out and say subjects, objects and subjects and objects. You know, the objects and those things that possess the objects. So an explanation of that presentation, as well as the presentation of awareness and knowledge. So awareness is this Tibetan word lo, and the word knowledge here is, or knowing, let's say awareness and knowing, is rikpa. So, in fact, there's, I think in the Nyingma tradition, is it Nyingma tradition, that Rigpa foundation? Same word, but it's in some cases Rigpa means primordial awareness in the Nyingma tradition sometimes. But here it's being taken in its more general sense as knowing. Almost you can take, knowledge almost sounds like a noun, doesn't it? Rather than a verb. Maybe they should both be verbs, awareness and knowing. I'm not sure. Explanation. So this particular subject matter, this kind of text, if you asked a student what they were studying, they'd say, I'm studying lo rig. Lo means awareness, rig means knowing. So that's the kind of the short title, this long thing here, lo rig. And it is part of a larger text, a kind of interesting name. There's a text called The Magical Key to the Path of Reasoning. Magical key, opening up the path of reasoning to be able to understand logic. This is a kind of magical key. To understand this, then you can open up, then you can understand the great texts on logic. Presentation of, this is from that text, The Magical Key to the Path of Reasoning, presentation of collected topics, revealing the meaning of the treatises on prime cognition. And this particular kind of subject matter, that itself, say the presentation of collected topics, do you know what that's called? Some of you might know. Do you, Venerable? No. Ben, back there, do you know? Someone? Dura, we say duvra, which means sort of like a compendium of topics that come up in the literature as a way, and analyzing it, but as a way to familiar yourself with the vocabulary so that later, when you engage in a study of this material, you'll have this vocabulary as a basis, be completely familiar with you. You'll be completely familiar. Well, maybe it'll be familiar with you too, I don't know. So that's the text that the students often begin with, dura, when they're sometimes when they're 12 or 13. You know, so anyone here? Everyone's here a little bit older than that, so you don't have to feel intimidated, although sometimes a lot of the material may seem very complicated. It's definitely doable. And one of the ways of being able to not be intimidated by it is to have some perseverance, some courage, some determination, and to familiarize yourself with it. That's also the meaning of meditation, isn't it? To familiarize. And anything that we familiarize with, I've taught this kind of subject several times, and people at the beginning say, oh my gosh, there's so many things to remember. And after maybe 2 weeks, 2 classes, they're already feeling quite comfortable with the material. Already they have a basis. And later, when you hear other teachings involving this kind of terminology, you'll be able to understand it much more deeply. So this is from this larger text, what we might call Dura, or collected topics, has various parts. What the collected topics are from? They're from the text, or here's his treatises on prime cognition. Were very famous teachings in Buddhism, treatises or great texts, expositions on what's called pramana. Have you heard that, somebody? Have you heard, Brish, do you know that term? Pramana? Pramana is a word that's going to come up on several occasions. The Tibetans, we say tsema. Sometimes it means prime cognition. Sometimes it just means validity, valid cognition, rather than prime cognition. In this context, we're talking about this subject matter from a certain philosophical point of view, so they're calling it prime cognition. But it isn't limited to that. This is the texts on pramana, which we're talking mainly about a philosophical subject of how we get to know, how we know, and how we can verify what we know is true. How do you know? How do you know this is really pink, or that you are really existing, and so forth, or that what you think is right is really true? How do you know this? How can you verify this? You know what that subject matter is called in philosophy? What is it? You know that? Well, in a sense, it's logic, but that's one part of this investigation, logic, epistemology. And it's not, I don't think you won't find reference to such a word in ancient treatises, epistemology. It's I believe from my own investigation that word came about like in the late 1870s as a construction from other languages, they could, in order to explain this kind of study. But that's essentially what you could call this. So the treatises on prime cognition, maybe you could say the text or treatises on epistemology, because it's not just prime cognition here, it's pramana, which means the study of what is valid, how we know, what are the different kinds of consciousness, and so forth, and how we can verify that those things are true. So this is the magical key to the path of reasoning, revealing the meaning of the treatises on epistemology or prime cognition or pramana, which is a presentation of the collected topics from those texts. So these kinds of topics, all of these topics are found in the pramana literature that we're going to be talking about. And that text that is studied, there are various parts. He said there's 3 parts. You might say the small, as often, the small, the medium, and the large. The beginning, the middle, and the end. And this is of the end, so this is called the greater path of reasoning. The first text that they study when they study the definition of color. Have you ever studied? Like one of the questions would be asked, is a white horse white? I won't go into that right now, but what do you think? Is a white horse white? Diane, what do you think? Dorji, what do you think? Dan? So Diane says yes. So in that context, they would learn, no, a white horse is not white because white is a color. A white horse is a horse, even though it has a white color. So they begin to learn the definitions and what constitutes proper line of debate, using very, very simple subjects like that. So, some of us might be fascinated by that, but others of us might find it incredibly boring. to use those examples, white, okay, a white horse is not white, and so forth. But that's what they begin to study, and then they study definitions of the categories, enumeration of the categories of phenomena. All phenomena, we learn in Dura, and we're going to talk about this in a second, basically could be lumped into two sections. Those that are impermanent, changing moment by moment, and those that are permanent. Are there any permanent phenomena? Consciousness is permanent. What do you think? Why is consciousness permanent? Interesting. Maybe
it just came out of my mouth, I guess, because that's the thing that continues.
Right. So we have to be careful here. When we're talking about permanent, what we mean by permanent is different than what we mean by eternal. What is eternal? That would be kind of forever, right? Eternal. Permanent doesn't mean something is necessarily eternal. There are things that are, this will, I was going to say blow your mind. There are some things which are temporarily permanent, temporal permanence, that for some period of time they exist and they do not change for that period of time. So anything that's permanent is not necessarily eternal. Can you think of anything like that? Yeah. Well, emptiness we talk about later. In the Mahayana especially, we say emptiness is permanent, right? So what about the emptiness of this pen? Does the emptiness of this pen exist forever? It came into existence only in dependence upon the pen. When the pen was first made and could be categorized as a pen, stamped out and the things are put together, and it's the pen. The emptiness of the pen existed at that time. It didn't exist before that. Emptiness is not some vague philosophical sort of space. It's something that is in relationship to conventional phenomena. It's their ultimate nature of being devoid of a findable true existence, right? And when this pen inevitably, the manufacturer might like to say it will last forever, but it will definitely, I'm not sure who the manufacturer is, not a famous manufacturer, liquid gel, metal tip. And when this goes out of existence, the emptiness will go out of existence. So that would be an example of something which is permanent, but not eternal. Okay, so the two terms are not identical. Can you think of something which is eternal, but impermanent? Maybe this young lady who answered the other question, what's your name? Mary Beth. Actually, your proposition at first, that would fit that category, wouldn't it? Because consciousness itself, we're going to be learning, is something which is impermanent, changing moment by moment. But it from the Buddhist perspective, it had no beginning, had no end. It has no end. Even when we become Buddhas, our consciousness, our stream of consciousness will continue. So we could just say, if we just talk about consciousness itself, that's something which is eternal, but impermanent. So we could find, maybe you could, if you check, you can find examples of the different things. There would be, how many alternatives would there be here? Be sort of four alternatives. So what we just talked about, impermanent and eternal. Impermanent and not eternal, it's easy. The pen itself, right? The conventional pen, or what's your name? Mark. Mark is a person. So Mark is the mark that we impute to this particular body and mind now is impermanent, changing moment by moment, and it is not eternal. Mark will go out of existence when this body disappears, right? The mind stream will continue. So something about continues. How about, which one did we leave off? Not eternal and not eternal and permanent. Right? What would that be? No, eternal and permanent. We did not eternal and permanent. That was emptiness, say the emptiness of the pen. So what would be? Maybe. Depends on the space you're talking about. Maybe, because usually space, although space is permanent, certainly space is also imputed upon some other kind of vacuity. So that there's nothing that's going to be around forever. It usually is imputed upon some world system, the sky or something like that, right?
I need space for things to exist.
Yeah, but our world system, space only exists when there's a world system coming into existence and not. So that might not be, that space might not be eternal. It'll be permanent when it's existing. How about the emptiness of your mind? The Buddha nature. That's eternal because your mind is eternal, and it's permanent because it's not changing moment by moment. Anyway, you can play around with that. So in the collected topics, these are some of the things that are gone over first of all about the different enumeration of phenomena. Those things are permanent, those that are impermanent, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. This particular text was written by a very great Tibetan saint called Purchok Jampa Gyatso. Here it says Purbuchok Jampa Gyatso. Purbuchok wrote some of the beginning textbooks that are used at several of the main monasteries. Many of them used for their collected topics, Purbuchok's collected topics, and also this text. And then after this, their own textbooks, their own monastic textbooks were written by someone from their own monastic tradition. So this is what we study at Sarah J, where Lama Yeshe and Mama Sopa Rinpoche studied when they were young, and almost all of my main teachers studied at Sarah J. This is the text that they studied, Purbuchok. So, explanation of the presentation of objects and subjects and objects. Usually we say it in that order. Oftentimes, when you have combinations like this, sometimes the Tibetan is such that they say Yul, Yul Chen. It sounds more euphonic. Do you know what I mean? So, sort of sounds nicer to the ear in that way. We would say subjects and objects, though, rather than objects and subjects, right, in our language. So you can say that. You could say explanation of a presentation of subjects and objects, as well as awareness and knowers from the greater part, the greater path of reasoning. So this is another phrase, path of reasoning. Tibetans, Buddhists in general, Mahayana Buddhists as I understand it, did not refer to themselves generally as Buddhists. Did you know that? Do you know what they refer to themselves as? What is your name? Daniel. Dharma students. Usually they refer to themselves as inner beings, Nangba, which some people take to mean kind of like, I was joking about this before, almost in an Italian sense of the inner circle, and everyone else is our outsiders. But it doesn't, the esoteric meaning doesn't mean that. Inner being means a person who looks for the solutions to problems within your own mind, rather than seeking, the solutions outside. It's their fault. It's that, that's the problem out there. I've mentioned in some other contexts, when I first went to the Kopan Monastery, maybe Sally remembers, in the early mid-70s, there were little pieces of paper on the walls that some of the Western students had written, because Lama was always saying phrases like this: first check inside, then check outside. If you got a problem, usually we always check, this is wrong. Well, check what says it. Why do you perceive that's wrong? Check inside. Is it really wrong? Is it inherently wrong? Check your own mind. Lama was always saying, check up, dear. Sometimes it could be quite so. Check up, dear. Don't use that when you're with your loved ones, as kind of retaliation. You shouldn't use the Dharma to clean up other people's acts, as they say. You use it to clean up your own mind. So don't go home and start using that as your pet phrase now. Check up. Yeah, I can just imagine that could happen. So another phrase like that, like inner being, another kind of way of talking about Buddhism from a Mahayana point of view. So inner beings is talking about the beings, the practitioners. A way of talking about Buddhism, another term is the path of reasoning. That's what it's talking about here, from the greater path of reasoning. That phrase, path of reasoning, doesn't identically mean Buddhist, but it kind of implies that Buddhism does not depend only on faith alone. We need faith. It's a virtuous mental factor. Okay? We need to have faith, but the Buddha himself said, you should check what I say. Check up what I say, the same way that you check gold. You know that, right? You know that famous phrase? Do you know, Maureen? Have you ever heard that? The Buddha said, you shouldn't accept what I say out of faith alone. You should check what I say as you would check gold. Now, I've never bought any gold. Have you bought any gold? Did you have to check? Chris, did you ever buy any gold when you were in India? No?
Not recently.
Not recently. Maybe previous life. But apparently one would check it various ways. You'd rub it on a rubbing stone or board to see various things, the color of what came off of it, if it was pure gold. And you would cut it to see if there were any impurities inside, like just a little thin layer of gold over a big lump of lead. You would burn it. You'd put it in fire, maybe in a sense to see kind of like, not its spectrum, they didn't have spectrometers, but you can see something when you burn, isn't it? You know, if you put copper in fire, it has its own particular kind of glow. Different things like this. So you check gold in various ways. I think a better example today is the way that we would check a car. You would take it, in the classic way when we were kids, they'd go around, you'd get your brother-in-law to come over and look at it, right? And he'd go around, kick the tires, take up the top, check, turn it over, take it for a test ride. You check it first before you buy it, isn't it? The car. So in the same way, the Buddha said you should check what he said. He wasn't saying when he said this that you should check what he said. He was not saying that you didn't have to believe what he said and you could just pick and choose. This is an interpretation I found that's very popular in America now. Have you noticed that? Some people like to say, well, this I like, this part of Buddhism, but this, I'm not so fond of. I'm not going to take that part. Because Buddha said you didn't have to accept what he said. That's not what he meant. He said, don't accept what he said out of faith alone. You should, if you have doubt about something or everything, you should really analyze it to understand what's really true. So you can see its consistency. So you develop real faith that's based on conviction rather than just blind faith, which is easily dissuaded. So sometimes path of reasoning is kind of an epithet of Buddhism in general. Does that make any sense to you? Okay. So inner being refers to Buddhists, and path of reasoning sometimes is applied to sometimes to Buddhism in general. Just in this regard, I just wanted to mention something. Buddha taught when you engage in any kind of study, when you engage in the practice of Dharma, Buddhism, you should engage in 4 reliances. Have you heard of the 4 reliances? Do you know? If I mention what they are, they'll ring a bell with some of you. Okay? First of all, you shouldn't rely on the teacher, but on the teaching. That is to say, on the charisma of the teacher. Someone who's beautiful or charismatic. Who's the fellow that's on late at night? Tony Robbins. Yeah? So like a big smile and, this must be right. All these people are following them, guru, what do you call it, you shouldn't rely on the person of the teacher. You should rely, or the charisma, you should rely on the teaching. What is being said. So listen to what is actually being said. And you shouldn't rely on the mere, then going a little step further, once someone is aware what to rely on and what not to rely on, don't rely on the mere sweet sound of the words, the euphony of the words, what would we say it in the West? The captivating, the interesting things. Oh yeah, whoa, this sounds good. Sometimes we get excited because teachers tell us things that we'd like to hear. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is good for us. Oh, it's good to eat chocolate, You should, don't rely on the mere words when you rely on the teaching, but you should rely on the meaning. So this is what we're going to try to do here, to understand the meanings of things. Rely on the meaning rather than just the mere words. There's a certain kind of wisdom that develops from hearing words, but there's a deeper wisdom that develops when you engage in analyzing the meaning of those words. We call the wisdom arisen from contemplation. You've heard that before, right? I forgot your name. In the middle, this young lady. What's your name? Bonnie. Have you heard of that? We talk about different kinds of wisdom. A wisdom that arises, first of all, when we hear or listen. Maybe that's kind of related to the first thing. We first rely on the teachings, not the person. Rely on the meaning, not the mere words. So that's talking about a second kind of wisdom that's called a wisdom arisen from contemplation. When after hearing something correctly and it making sense superficially, you begin to analyze it in various ways, up, down. Also, this is why the debate is such a great tool in understanding the teachings, because you're forced, when you debate, to confront something that you thought looked this way. I can't even focus on this. I thought it was this way, but then Venerable tells me, oh no, it's black. I said, no, it's white and little crisscrosses. But then when I have to look at it from her point of view, I see there are other. You see what I'm saying? You look at it, some subject that you thought you had down pat. If you're discussing it with someone else who understood it from a different perspective, they're going to say something about that, and you're going to say, no, you're wrong. And they're because you don't understand it that way. But in debating with them, discussing with them, you're confronted with that, and you have to come to grips with a deeper understanding. So, first reliance, don't rely on the person, rely on the teachings. Second, don't rely on the mere words, the euphony, the nice sound, or the attractiveness, but rely on the meaning. Then, thirdly, don't rely on what might be called the interpretable meaning, but rely on the definitive meaning of what was being said. This has a lot of explanation later on in our study when we talk about the difference between the definitive and the interpretable sutras. What were to be taken as definitive, when the Buddha said. Sometimes the Buddha said, there is a self. Did you know that? Were you here last night?
I wasn't.
Oh no, okay. I thought you were the one that Amy was joking about last night. There was some fellow who who was his name? Yeah, she was teasing you quite a bit. What's your name? Lex. When we talk about interpretable sutras and definitive sutras, have you ever heard of that before?
I think I have.
The study, or that the Buddha actually, in some cases, actually said to some people, there is a self. Although in other cases, when he explained in depth, he said there is no self. So one has to be able to understand from the context what is meant literally on one level, what is to be interpreted, what was meant definitively. So that's a deeper level of understanding. So don't rely on the sort of, you might say, in the superficial sense. You don't rely on the literal sense of the words, but delve into what's definitively, the definitive meaning, not the literal meaning. And finally, don't rely on simply a conceptual consciousness, a conceptual understanding, but eventually develop a non-conceptual, direct perception of reality in deep meditation. Realize things directly. That is what will eventually be able to eliminate from our mind all the stains. Say, for instance, when we realize emptiness directly, not just with by means of our intellect. Those are called the four reliances. And I think it's worthwhile knowing at this time about that, because oftentimes there are a lot of teachers that come that are very charismatic. And even we're happy, different centers because they make lots of money for the center, I'm not sure that's always the best rationale. Go on.
Could you repeat the last one again?
Don't rely on a conceptual understanding. And we'll talk about what that means. This is what the course is. One of the things the course is about: conceptual versus direct perception. But rely on a direct realization, direct perception of that. Okay, this just sort of is a little bit of introduction. How are you feeling? Okay? Okay. So we'll take a break, we'll have a stretch-up break in a couple of minutes. But let's just go a little bit further. Can you manage? You okay? Okay. So you might say, well, if he goes at this rate, we'll never finish the course because he hasn't even done the title yet. But actually, there's a lot. You might think the title page. Actually, the title page is very, very important because it can tell you what the whole subject is about. It has a lot of meaning to it, right? And so Purbachok, you know who Purbachok was? Purbachok, this particular author, I think, lived in several centuries ago. Purbachok Jampa Gyatso. I think that he was understood by many people to be an incarnation of Maitreya, the Buddha Maitreya, and very blessed. And his more recent reincarnations was the abbot who gave some of my teachers their ordination. One of my teachers, Jampa Gyatso, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, his Jampa came from the Purbachok Jampa Gyatso. So his incarnations, I think, existing still till today. And this particular translation that we have of this famous text, very traditional text, was done by a very excellent scholar, Elizabeth Napper, called her Betsy Napper, Elizabeth, more properly, who is PhD from Virginia, University of Virginia, was married to the Buddhist scholar, the Buddhist scholar Jeffrey Hopkins was married to her for some time. I should put it more in perspective. And they've subsequently gone on their own Dharma trails after that. She's presently, I think, in India as helping the Nuns Project in, is that right, Soma, do you know? In Dharamsala? Is that it? Sally, do you know? Dormaling. And a very excellent person, very kind and a good, very kind benefactor also. And when she was translating, earlier doing a lot of translations, she did this text amongst others on awareness and knowledge. So it's a very excellent translation. And with her permission, as you see, it's been reproduced for the FPMT basic program. So if Betsy ever sees these tapes, thank you, Betsy. Elizabeth. Now, just to get a little perspective, the way these texts were often written is it's sort of a triad of sections, and we're not going to do all of them. First of all, there was a presentation, first of all, of other people's viewpoints, like what other people think the definitions are. Sometimes they're completely corny, complete misconceptions, like nincompoops like myself, what we might say in debate. Maybe some of them are drawn from debate. Some of them are actually assertions in the first section, assertions of other scholars and texts that the author of the text in question, in this case Purbachok, would be finding issue with. He was saying, some people say this, but look, there's logical inconsistency because of this and that and this and that. There's sort of debates that go on. Then there is, secondly, after you've sort of presented a lot of other positions, it's kind of rejected them. Rejected those wrong positions. Then you present your own position. We call wrong look. Wrong means self. Have you heard of this before? The wrong look? Wrong means self. Look means tradition or system. So it's our system. That means one's own system of how you define things, how the definitions are, how the divisions are, how you understand the inner consistency of all the teachings. That's the section mainly we're going to be studying, because we don't have the leisure to debate on all of these subjects. And then the third part is, after you've presented your position, other people can say, well, you made fun of my position, now look at your position is full of holes too. So it's other people trying to, find fault with wrong look, and our own position defending it and saying, no, because of this, you're wrong. This is still right. And then someone else says, this is wrong for this reason. You say, no, because this, and this is still right, you're wrong. So those three kinds of sections usually are presented. And sometimes if you look at like the first part of this text, if you start reading some of these, you'll think, wow, how can I possibly understand this? This has no sense at all. So what we're going to skip over the first presentation, okay? And we're going to go up to the wrong look on page 9. You see page 9? It says, our own system, the third line down of the text. You see a little darker? Wrong look. So these first couple of pages have been talking just about objects. This is the first, I was going to say subject. Object. This is the first subject. This is the first thing that's being talked about, objects. And then we go into subjects or object possessors. So, with regard to that, just to explain, first of all, we talk about objects and subjects and objects. Everything, an object is a synonym of anything that's existent. All existent phenomena are objects of consciousness, some consciousness. Even if they're so subtle and obscure, they're not the objects of ordinary mortal beings' consciousness. They're the objects of consciousness of the omniscient mind. So in a sense, all phenomena are objects, very real sense. And so there are various synonyms here, we could say. Basically, we could divide up, let's say, everything into this. One way of enumerating it is like this: the selfless, because everything, whether it exists or doesn't exist, is selfless or empty, okay? And you could divide that up into two parts: existence and non-existence. You know, when I'm using existent with an NT at the end, not existence, not existence and non-existence. What's a non-existent? Venerable, would you know someone? Was it? Flying pig. I thought flying pigs existed. Okay, that's pretty good. That's pretty good, yeah. Flying pig. Can you think of a non-existent? Anyone? What do you think? Come on, there are many famous ones. In the famous, we talk about skyflower. What's the origin of that idea? What does that mean, a skyflower? Some people think there's this marigold floating in the sky or something? What is a skyflower? Yeah? I think, do you know, Sally? I think the origin, that's one of the expressions that's often used for a non-existent. It's like a skyflower. The Hinayana practitioners, when the Mahayana was beginning to proliferate, they would sometimes, I think even Vasubandhu, the brother of Asanga, actually criticized the Mahayana when his brother Asanga tried to introduce it to him. And he said, the Mahayana is like a skyflower, just like a figment of your imagination, a non-existent thing. The Buddha never taught that. So this is a phrase that's been used. I think the origin is something to do with rainbows. To some people in some situation, a configuration, maybe between the clouds, a certain part of rainbow being there, are very bright colors. Maybe someone might think there's a flower growing in the sky. There's something called sky flowers. Anyway, that's an example of a non-existent. One of the other classic ones, do you need a break? One of the other classic ones is what do you think? So the sun, the kind of, you might say, well, she could have adopted him. She could have had him before she became barren. Well, this is not talking about that. It's talking about, to someone's mind who's not thinking that a woman who is barren has an actual son that she gave birth to. So that's a non-existent, the classic example, the son of a barren woman. Another classic example that we find in the literature is the horns of a rabbit. Rabbit horns. Have you heard of that before?
We've all seen them.
Pardon?
We've all seen them.
You've all seen rabbit horns? One of my teachers, Geshe Jumpa Tekchok, he had a very wry sense of humor. So when he was teaching us, I'm not sure, Dura even, in Manjushri Institute. You remember Geshe Tekchok, right, Bruce? When he was teaching, you remember Helmut, the monk? Helmut, very serious German monk, was in front. And at the beginning, when we were saying prayers and being very pious, Geshe took out this little postcard that someone had sent him of a rabbit with a big set of horns on the top. And he put it in front of Helmut, and Helmut was laughing, was trying to keep serious because it was the prayer time, and Geshe was teasing. So, what's the origin of that? Are there rabbits with horns? I mean, there might have been somewhere along the evolutionary trail, but that's not the point. What's being referred to here is the mistaken idea that when you see, so you get up in the morning and you look out in the field on a foggy morning and you see a little rabbit stick its head up, and you see its little ears, and you think, oh, there's horns. So mistaking the ears for horns, one might conceive of a horned rabbit, but a horned rabbit doesn't exist, or the horns of a rabbit. Those are examples of non-existent phenomena that we can mistakenly imagine, right? Or let's say the water in a mirage. Is that a non-existent? There is no water in the mirage, is there? It's kind of empty of water. What are you going to say, Clayton? There is water there? Just have to go far enough? Or there is gold at the end of the rainbow? Okay? The most important non-existent that we should be concerned with is a sense of self, identity, that we perceive and we think is so real. That is a non-existent, and we have to understand that it is non-existent, because our ignorance now believes in that, it grasps to that, it perceives it, believes in it, grasps to that, assents to that. So that's kind of the sense of, so if we divide up, everything that could exist is selfless, and that's divided up into those that do exist and those that are non-existent. And mainly we're talking about existence. Existence now, object is a synonym of existent. Anything that is existent is an object, because it's the object of some consciousness. That's why it's called an object. It's object in the sense of there being some consciousness that apprehends it and therefore possesses that object to some extent. That's why it's called yulchen, or has that object as its object of engagement or apprehension. That's why it was called object possessors in the cover. Remember we said presentation of objects and object possessors. So subjects are called object possessors. So everything that exists is called an object on one level. Another synonym, you know the different synonyms of existence? Do you know, Sally? Have you studied? We say okay, so we say existent. That's a good one. Tibetan, the Sanskrit is sat. You might have heard of that. Then one famous one, dharma. What does dharma mean? In Tibetan we say chö. Dharma is another phenomena it means phenomena, we could say in this context. And that is a synonym. If something is a dharma, it exists. It is the object of some consciousness. Okay, there's another synonym. So we have what? Existent, dharma, object. The Tibetan word for object is yul, like Y-U-L, I guess you could kind of write it. Not yul, yul. Also, sheja. Do you know what sheja means? Sheja means object of knowledge, that which can be known. That's another synonym. So all of those are synonyms of existence. And in this text, one that comes up in the very beginning, that will come in the next sentence, I think, is established base. The basis for establishing some phenomena, something which exists, is also called an established base. So I'm just going to give this first definition and the divisions, then we're going to take a little stretch break, okay? So concerning the first, that is to say, concerning the first, from among the two objects and subjects, or objects and object possessors, concerning objects, the definition of an object is that which is known by an awareness. So objects here are defined not in terms of being objects for any other reason. The real meaning of object in this sense, when we say objects and subjects, is that they are objects of an awareness, that they are known by, cognized, understood by some consciousness or awareness. Okay? That's why they're called objects. The consciousness that's knowing them is the subject, or the object possessor, that which has that object. Okay? And when objects are divided, here it says there are three. We're going to talk a little more elaborate. There are appearing objects, determined objects, and objects of engagement. Okay, now we can make that list a little bit, because it's going to be elaborated anyway in the very near future. So we could kind of say there are 6 kind of objects that we're going to be talking about. 3 of them are here. Okay, we could start with any of them. Let's start with appearing objects. A synonym of appearing object is the beheld object, or in Tibetan we say zungyul. Okay, so you could add, say, right under appearing objects, you could make an equal sign and say that's the same as beheld object. Okay, zungyul. Completely synonymous. If something is an appearing object, it's the beheld object. Determined objects, this is referring to objects that are known by conception. That's the actual thing that the mind is getting at when we conceive of something. Objects of engagement can be for perception or conception. They're the object that you actually are engaging in. And for determined object, you could say conceived object. That's not a different word, it's just a different way of translating. The determined objects, we could say shenyul. So we've got engaged objects, or objects of engagement, determined objects, or conceived objects. There's just a different translation of the same word. Appearing objects, those 3, I was reading backwards, and appearing objects are the same as a 4th category called beheld, or we could say beheld objects. Then there's 2 other objects, one of which has a complicated name. We say in Tibetan, zintangiyul, the object of the mode of apprehension. I think that's how it's actually translated here also. Yeah, I see. The object of the mode of apprehension. Or we could call that, you could call that something more, shorthand if you want. But that's another object, zintangiyul. Usually, that is synonymous with the engaged object, as the object of the mode of apprehension. And then finally, something that's now radically different than these. Some of these are quite different, but a sixth one, the referent object or the observed object, the object of observation, the mikul. Have you studied some Tibetan, Venerable? No? Mikpa means to observe or to refer to. So the mikul, say for instance, if you are trying to understand the color of the flower, the referent object, the mikul, would be the flower, and the engaged object would be its color, that which you're engaging in. What you're referring to is the flower, but then you're engaging or entering into some quality of it. Okay? So let's take a little break. Now you can, if you feel like you've had too much, you can escape out the door. The pressure's gotten too much. Oh, someone had a question before. I'm sorry. You had a question, huh? Oh, I think you had. There's not another synonym, but there are different ways you could translate it. You could translate it as observed object, but that's not talking about a synonym. That's just another way of translating the same term. The observed object. Okay. You have a question?
I'm trying to understand the color of the flower.
Yeah.
Then the referent object is the flower. And what object is the color?
The color would be the engaged object and the object of the mode of apprehension. And, yeah, like that. So let's take a little break. If you like to stretch, if you need to take a quick visit to the asking, and Diana were asking about space, and I mentioned that there are two kinds of space in the scriptures. One is called, this word for space is namka in Tibetan, and in Sanskrit is akasha. There's one of the 8 famous bodhisattvas was called Akasha Garbha. So the Garbha means womb or essence. Akasha Garbha, essence of space. So one kind of space is what we mean generally by space here is defined as the absence of any kind of obstructive contact. Okay? That's something which is intellectually understood. It's not something you see. You might say, well, excuse me. I see there's nothing between me and Chris. I'm seeing space. Excuse me. But that's not space. What you're seeing, that's not the subtle kind of space. That is what's called Dharma namka. Dharma means intermediate. So that's something that's visible and might take, like for instance, when we say, I see space, outer space, it's black or it's the sky, space is blue. That's not what's meant by the absence of obstructing contact. What you're seeing, which you can perceive with your sense consciousnesses, in the case of your eye consciousness, and also your hand with your eye, if it's dark, oh, there's some space here. What you're feeling or what you're seeing is Dharma namka, the intermediate space. And that is an impermanent phenomena that you can impute through your intellect. You can know that space is devoid of any obstructing contact through various kinds of means, by transparency, but that's not always a perfect thing, isn't it? Is it? Because it could be a perfectly clear piece of crystal glass between us and I. Where do you see that sometime? As it comes in the movies, or you might have walked into a glass door sometime. Yeah. So you can check with your tactile sensation if there's any contact. So that's the impermanent space, the intermediate space. But the actual space is the lack of obstructing contact, the absence of obstructing contact. And that definition is very, very useful because when we talk about emptiness, that's a quality similar to emptiness. Space is a mere negation. It only negates obstructing contact. It doesn't affirm something else in its place, like transparency or beauty or openness. It's a mere negation, negating any kind of contact. And emptiness shunyata. Sometimes people say, oh, I've even seen great lamas, and especially in the Nyingma Kagyu Sakya tradition, or Nyingma Kagyu usually, saying, oh, that's not a good translation for shunyata, to say emptiness, as though there is something more implied by the word shunyata. Shunya means empty, right? Shunyata means the state of being empty or emptiness. The atta at the end makes it like what you do to a noun to make it like that. Empty or empty is what? Is empty a noun? An adjective. And so when you make an adjective into a noun, what do you call that? Something. You know what I'm talking about in grammar. When you nominalize it, when you make an adjective into a name, into a noun. But there is a great meaning, because from the Buddhist scriptures, Nagarjuna's explanation about emptiness and so forth, emptiness itself, when we just talk about ultimate truth, that is the absence of true existence. The mere negation in your own realization, negating a certain kind of existence, say on your own self-identity, nothing else implied, and so the resulting appearance to your mind when you meditate that way, first of all, is what's called space-like meditation on emptiness, because it's like space, there's nearly absent of any kind of appearance of true existence. That's kind of the sense of, that's why they call it space-like meditation. Have you heard that expression before, space-like meditation? In meditative equipoise, that's what we do. When we're meditating on emptiness, there are two kinds of meditation on emptiness. One is space-like meditation on emptiness, and what's the other one called? Sally? Yeah. I know. Illusion-like meditation on emptiness. So you see in Lama Chopa also, when we get to the verses on the perfection of wisdom, talking about these two kinds of meditations on emptiness. And also in the Lan Rim, we often talk, when you're in meditative equipoise on emptiness, and nothing else is appearing to your mind, only emptiness, like space, like a little bit like the experience we were trying to emulate at the beginning, but maybe that was a positive phenomena. Here we're talking about just a negative phenomena. And we'll talk more about what this means later. Just the absence of true existence. Akasha Garbha. I like you know who the 8 great bodhisattvas were, very quickly? Manjushri, Avalokiteshvara, Vajrapani, 3 famous ones. Maitreya, Samantabhadra, you've heard of all those, right? Then the 3 brothers, not they weren't brothers, but I think of the names. Akasha Garbha, Skiti Garbha, who we have a statue of on the hill, Skiti Garbha, one of the 8 great bodhisattvas. And the last one, you know, these names were very nice, right? You know, my son, Skiti Garbha, my son, Vajrapani. So, then the last one, Sarva Avarana Nishkambini. You know, I always thought being named George when I was growing up was bad, you know. But what if, or Daniel, Daniel is not bad, but what if you were named Sarva Avarana Nishkambini? It would have been more of a drag. And I can't imagine why his mother named him that. Sarva Avarana Nishkambini means one who has completely purified all of the obscurations. Arvarana. Avarana means obscuration. Sarva means all, like Sarva Dharma, right? All dharmas. Sarva Avarana Nishkambini. Those were the 8 great bodhisattvas that were close disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha. Okay, anyway, this is just an aside. So, the definition, first definition that we have, you should, if you can, try to memorize. The definition of an object is that which is known by an awareness. And we basically, here we've said appearing objects, and we've said that another synonym of that, another kind of object is the beheld, or what's the text translated as, Venerable? You saw? What's the other word here? Apprehended object. Okay, you could, later in the text it's called apprehended object. That's the same as I'm translating beheld object, I think. Okay? There's two different objects, but they're from two different points of view. They're synonyms, though. They're talking about the same thing from two different points of view. Two different of the six objects I mentioned. Then determined object, you could also translate that. It's not a different object. You could translate it as conceived object. But it kind of has the flavor. Shenba means to, not just to conceive, it means to kind of weigh or intellectually determine. So that's why they translate it as determined object. So that's an object which is known by a conception in some degree. And then the object of engagement, which is synonymous with what? The object of the mode of apprehension. So how many do we have there? We have appearing and apprehended. Those are two. And determined or conceived, that's the third one. Objects of engagement, 4, and objects of the mode of apprehension, 5. And then one other that is not immediately synonymous with those is called the referent object or observed object, the mikul. You know the word mikpa, don't you? From the mantra of Lama Tsongkhapa, mikme sewe ter chen chen rezi. Do you know that mantra? You've heard, some of you have heard it. Mikpa, so mikme would mean what? Maybe some of you know some Tibetan. Mepa means not. Not. So not or non-observable or non-referential. Mikme sewa. Sewa means mercy or compassion. So mikme sewe is an epithet of Chenrezi, of the Buddha of compassion. Non-referential compassion. It doesn't mean that he's kind of spaced out and doesn't refer to anything. It means he doesn't observe or refer to any truly existent phenomena. That means it's a kind of compassion which is conjoined with the wisdom realizing emptiness. There are different levels of compassion. Kind of our idiot compassion, if I could be as bold as to say it, there's not really idiot compassion because it's still compassion, simply observes sentient beings as suffering, but might conceive of them as being permanent. Their suffering is permanent. They're permanent. Might conceive of them as being having a self, and so forth, and might conceive of them as truly existent, even. That kind of first kind of compassion. There's another kind of compassion that observes sentient beings having first understood impermanence, and that sentient beings are impermanent, their suffering is impermanent. That's called a compassion observing phenomena, knowing more than just mere suffering. You follow what I'm saying? There's a deeper kind of compassion. Even in the world, say someone who has that kind of knowledge that this will pass, they don't get so caught up in, their compassion can be more authentic, helping people. Right now, when we try to be compassionate, if we go overboard and we expect things to change right away, not realizing that it depends on karma, and we think that the suffering is real and really unbearable and so forth and permanent, we get caught up and we get burned out. And I think people who are healers often notice kind of experiences like that when you put yourself in a situation like that. So the third kind of compassion is one that's conjoined with wisdom that doesn't refer to a truly existent phenomena or doesn't observe. So mikme doesn't observe a truly existent phenomena. It doesn't mean by accident it doesn't observe, it was looking the wrong way. It means it looks at the person and the suffering but knows them to be devoid of a truly existent person. So that's called mikme sewa. Non-referential or non-objectifying, sometimes is translated as. It means a compassion that doesn't believe there's a truly existent object there. It's mercy. Okay. So these are the six kind of objects we're going to be talking about. And we're going to just go a little bit further today, and then we'll review and go a little bit further next time and start on subjects. So as a exercise for you, you might want to read this section again in the light of everything that we've said and what we will say before the class is over. We still have some time. And to read the section in the next section on subjects, object possessors, chapter 2. Basically, it doesn't go much further than this on this page. You might read some of the other debates after page 9, but mainly the presentation of Rangluk, our system, is mainly on page 9 here. And then the next is coming the refutation of other people's objections, okay, about our own system. Then chapter 2 on page 12, if you read page 12 next time also, about object possessors, or in other words, subjects, then we get into what the main topic of the course is about, because all the subjects are talking about consciousness, and that's what we're going to be talking about. What consciousness is, how we know, and so forth. But in order to know consciousness, you have to know the objects of consciousness, what kind of objects different consciousnesses have in order to understand those consciousnesses better. So let's go into a little more detail here. I'm reading just after that. It says, the appearing object of a particular awareness and apprehended object of that awareness are synonymous. Okay? So I had called it beheld object. Here it's called the apprehended object. Same word. So when you have appearing object here, you can have, that's actually synonymous with another kind of object, the apprehended object. Whatever is an established base, I'm reading further, is necessarily an appearing object. So what does that mean? Do you remember what I said, as you may have only heard it once in passing and it went right past your ear. Remember what an established base is? I said it before, maybe you didn't make a note of it. Established base is one of the synonyms of phenomena, of existent phenomena. Everything that exists is an established base or an established basis for perception. So that's just another way in some context of referring to something that exists, an object. So anything which is an object, you could say, whatever is an established base, is necessarily an appearing object. Why is that? Because it's got to appear to a conceptual consciousness, and it's got to appear to some conceptual consciousness, and it's got to appear to some direct perceptual consciousness. Basically, we will talk about in a lot of detail the difference between perception and conception. But do you know a little bit the difference? Chris, do you know what the difference between perception and conception is?
Perception would be with the perceivers, the eyes, the ears, touch. And the conception would be that which follows immediately dissecting it and determining what it is. Putting words and concepts over that.
That would be right, I think. But what does that dissection? Like, for instance, if I see a cup of nice tea, or I'll say because we have Chinese students here, say nice tofu meal, and I think, oh, that looks so delicious. Is that conception being done with my eye consciousness that's seeing it?
No.
Or is that being done?
Mind.
By the mind. Isn't this mind? Isn't eye consciousness mind?
I don't know.
So we'll learn about that. Yeah, usually the word mind is used exclusively for what you're thinking, for the mental consciousness. We could use it just to refer to that. We could say this is consciousness, but when we talk about mind, it kind of implies mental consciousness. So you're right there. Now, so the mind it's only the mental consciousness that has conception. Our eyes, our ears, our ear consciousness, our nose consciousness, our taste consciousness, and our tactile consciousness, all are kind of perceivers, like the camera. It doesn't do any thinking. It just is a conduit. It knows the objects, but it doesn't think about them. It doesn't conceive about them. All of that's done by our mental consciousness. It knows objects it can know objects in a different way via some other kind of mode of knowing that we call conception, that we'll talk about more. But can the mental consciousness perceive also? Can it know things directly, or is it limited to conception?
I don't know. In meditation, I suppose you could just use that conceptual mental awareness without direct perception of what I guess would be a previous direct perception that you'd be recalling. So,
What do you think? Does anyone know? This is a good point. Usually for us now, our mental consciousness is more or less limited to conception. We'll talk about this later. There's some, in a continuum of ordinary beings like ourselves, there are some instances of perception, like one thought instant at the end of a train of eye consciousness. Maybe the mental consciousness perceives it, the object, directly in some sense. But that goes past us because it lasts such a short instant. It's what we call inattentive. We don't pay attention to it. It's so short. There might be something like mental direct perception in some lucid dreams, but that's debatable. Generally, the first time that we might have direct perception with our mental consciousness is when, having developed single-pointed concentration, we might realize some object with what's called yogic direct perception. We'll learn about one of the kinds of direct perception. Yogic direct perception is a mental direct perception which can be developed by realizing subtle impermanence or selflessness of the person. That can be known, first, it has to be known, first of all, via a mental image. We think about it, we analyze it, or as you said, we dissect it in various ways. We get a mental image of what selflessness means. Eventually, we can have a direct perception. This is a little bit tricky in these tenets. We can know selflessness directly, but we're not. But it's we can know. Sorry, we put it this way: we can know it with direct perception, but not directly. Okay, this is good. Now Chris is meditating on that. See, he's trying to get that. He's saying, "What is it? Direct perception, but not directly," because in these tenets that we're studying now, this is called the Sautrantika school. Have you heard of the Sautrantika school? The higher of the two Hinayana schools. The Vaibhashika had 18 subsets. That's the lowest of the Hinayana schools. Have you heard of the Vaibhashikas? And like, for instance, the Staiviravadins, today called the Theravada, are one of those 18 schools of the Vaibhashika, philosophical schools. Slightly more sophisticated viewpoint were those Buddhists that call themselves the Sautrantikas, the followers of Sutra, you might say. Sautranta, like sutra. Sautrantikas, from their this text, this presentation is mainly from the Sautrantika point of view. You might say, well, why are we studying this? Excuse me. Not only are we Mahayanists, we're Prasangika Madhyamakas, right? No, well, we have to start, this is the tradition of how to understand the intention of Buddha. In order to understand that subtle presentation of emptiness, we have to understand these things which seem eminently reasonable to us here. Later we see a finer reasoning in which this is refuted. Okay, so don't put down the Sautrantika system. But according to the Sautrantika system, we're going to learn if something is an object of direct perception, it has to be impermanent. Only impermanent phenomena, things, functioning things, right, Venerable? Do you remember this? Someone? The only things that can be perceived by direct perception for Sautrantika are impermanent phenomena. We see that with our senses. Our senses only know impermanent things. They don't know the permanence, the shunyata or the space. That's something that's known by the mental consciousness via conception. So if something... direct perceivers, the appearing object of a direct perception has to be an impermanent object. It's synonymous. It's another synonym of impermanent phenomena is the appearing object of direct perception. Anything that appears and is the main principal object appearing to a direct perception that it's knowing is necessarily an impermanent phenomena. So the mental direct perception, if we were to have a yogic direct perception of selflessness, we have a direct perception, we've realized it without any veil, but what we're actually knowing directly with that consciousness has to be an impermanent phenomena. It can't be selflessness, which is permanent. Selflessness, like emptiness, is permanent. Remember at the beginning we were saying, although you may not have that established in your mind yet. So what is that, according to these tenets, what is the selflessness of persons, that direct perception perceiving? It's perceiving the aggregates. It's perceiving the body and mind. What's it? Your friend name? Mark. Mark is perceiving, say if I'm meditating on the emptiness of Mark, perceiving Mark's impermanent aggregates and indirectly knowing, with that direct perception, indirectly knowing, therefore, that he's devoid of a permanent, partless, independent self. Because I'm directly perceiving the impermanent parts, the collection of aggregates. Okay? Does that make some sense? We'll talk about it later, but just sort of as a prelude to that. So, whatever is an established base, that means whatever exists is necessarily an appearing object. Why? Because whatever is a thing, now a thing here means functioning thing. Very famous word in Sanskrit, bhava. Have you heard of bhava? Bhava shuddha sarva dharmas bhava shuddha ham. Thing, in Tibetan we say ngopo. It kind of implies, in this context, it doesn't mean thing in general, permanent thing, impermanent. It means a particular kind of impermanent thing, something which changes moment by moment. A thing is a synonym, is the same as impermanent phenomena. If something is an impermanent phenomena, it is a thing, a functioning thing. So, it started out by saying whatever is an established base, whatever it exists, is necessarily an appearing object. Why? Because if it's impermanent, if it's a thing, it's necessarily the appearing object of a direct perceiver. Remember we were just saying that? The appearing object of a direct perceiver, it has to be an impermanent phenomena, which means a thing. So it's tossing in many words here to kind of, maybe to exercise the mind. At the beginning you might say it's trying to confuse you. If you were thinking more generously, you might think it's trying to exercise your mind. This is because whatever is a thing is necessarily the appearing object of a direct perceiver, and whatever is permanent is necessarily the appearing object of a conceptual consciousness. So this is the last thing I'll say today about this, about the appearing object of a conceptual consciousness. To conception, how conception differs from perception. Perception, let's say the eye consciousness, eye perceiver, it knows something by that object, the object appearing directly to that consciousness, to the eye consciousness, right? The appearing object of this eye consciousness is the same as the engaged object, the object that I'm getting at, the flower. It is appearing, that's the main thing, appearing to the consciousness, the impermanent phenomena, flower, and it is what's being engaged, what's being apprehended. Okay? But for a conception, if I think about the flower, although in a philosophical sense you could say the flower is appearing to conception, that's not the principal object that's appearing. When you think of your mom, I forget your name. Carrie. When you think of your mom, is your mom's face or her personality directly appearing to your consciousness? Is that the principal thing that you're knowing your mom from? No. Yeah, no. I think that's no, right? I remember, I have to learn California again. Yeah, no. Sorry, I just joking. So, yeah, no. When I'm thinking of my mom, in fact, my mom's passed away, so I couldn't be perceiving her right now, but I have a mental image in my mind. It seems like that I can know my mom that way, or I can know the London Bridge or something else. The appearing object to that conception is, we could call a mental image, but that's not the technical term that's used in the literature. Do you know what the Venerable, Venerable, do you remember? A meaning generality. And it has a lot of meaning, actually, that term, a meaning generality, dunji. What is appearing? Let's call it, first of all, just a mental image. We are knowing something, like, say, the flower. When we think about the flower, even when our eye is opened and we're seeing the flower, we're thinking about it via a mental image of that, something that we've developed through some experience, or either correct or wrong. That mental image is actually is said to be a permanent phenomena. The mental image. You might say, well, wait a second, I can see my mom's arms flailing, and she's screaming at me, and then she was tucking me in bed. And what do you mean it's permanent? It's moving. But from this is something we have to investigate as time goes on. In general, a mental image is said to be permanent. It's not changing moment by moment. The mental image we have of cup, of mother, and so forth. And so the appearing object of conception is a permanent phenomena. Any permanent phenomena is necessarily the appearing object of some conception, realizing it. Okay? In the same way that if it's the appearing object of a perception, any impermanent phenomena has to be the appearing object of some perception. Anything that's impermanent. Even if it's very subtle, it's perceived by the Buddha's consciousness. Okay? And I see some courageous faces, sir. Are you okay? Yeah. Okay. So let's leave it there, and let's see if you've got any questions or comments. And what I suggest is next time, finish reading page 9 and begin on page 12. Chapter 2, and in time we'll go into some of these other ones where, first of all, before our own tradition, the other tradition is presented, and then we'll go into some of the refutations, the attempts of refutation, when we refute the refutations of others. What were you going to say?
So is the mental object always based on an impermanent,
The mental image?
always based on an impermanent object and experience?
No. It could be, we could have the mental image of a permanent thing also. But the mental image itself is permanent.
Okay.
But it could be the mental image of something which is impermanent, like our mom, or chocolate cake, or our consciousness, or the weather.
Could you explain how, or is this jumping ahead, how is it a permanent object, not mental image?
Just one other thing first, and then I'll address that. We could also be thinking about permanent things, like space. We can have a mental image of space, which is actually, in one sense, is space itself, if it is correct a mental image. If we don't really know what space is, we just have a mental image, like an imagination of it, we could say that's a generic image that's not really space itself. But if we've really discerned what space is, I think that mental image, because it has to be, if it's a permanent phenomena, it has to be the appearing object of some conception. It itself has to appear as the mental image of some conception, because the mental image itself is permanent. So space itself at one point would be the actual appearing object of that conception. So you could conceive of permanent and impermanent things. In fact, we can conceive of anything. We can, by conception, we can think about anything. Now, in terms of why it's permanent, this is one of the great investigations in Indian logic, Buddhist logic. How we know things by conception. There's a lot of investigation, like we know things via some kind of generality about them. Because they're not appearing by the force of that object appearing directly to our consciousness. They're appearing to our consciousness in a sense indirectly. I'll just mention a little bit, and sort of, what do they say, like in the movies, a teaser. Like I saw in some of the movies, they say, the teaser trailer. The trailer that kind of got you, oh, I want to see that one. How we have the mental image of a cow. First of all, everything other than a cow, we could say, is a non-cow. This is a non-cow, isn't it? This is a non-cow, this is a non-cow, there's no cow here, so everything here is a non-cow. If you have a set of things, like say flour, I wanted to point out that flour. First of all, I can say say this is flour A, my special flour, my pink flour. Non-flour A is everything in the universe other than this flour, right? So it's sort of like everything else is selected except this little spot in the middle. And then you say the opposite of that. The opposite of non-flour is back to here, right? So the opposite of a non-cow is, it's said in logic, and we can investigate this, why. You can read and investigate various texts. The opposite of a non-cow is how we intellectually determine the mental image of a cow. We come across that, we develop that mental image somehow in that process. And that itself, a generality, will be a permanent kind of phenomena in general. It's something, at first, let's just leave it there, just as a teaser. And maybe as you read a little bit, as the course progresses, we'll get a little bit better feeling for it. One very, very useful book that might put some of this in perspective is this book, also Elizabeth Napper, you can see on here, also translated with one great Tibetan Lama, one of my teachers, Lati Rinpoche, one of the great Tibetan contemporary masters. Is he one of your teachers also? Oh, you were just, I thought you were going like this, you were just yawning. Sorry. I thought that was nice. Say, Lati Rinpoche, his exposition when he was at University of Virginia many years ago visiting as a scholar, and Elizabeth Napper worked with him. I think it's the same period when she did Purbachok's translation. He does another low-rig text, which doesn't have so much elaboration, but he does refer to Purbachok sometime. And here he says, Purbachok says, and then this other so-and-so says, and this will be very flavorful if you get it. I think, Dorji, do you have in the bookstore? Or we have here? We just sold out. So you can find on, Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble or what probably you can find in town. This is very excellent. There's another text that Don has. Could you hold up, Don? Called, let me help. So the camera. No, Dorji, I don't want poor Dorji to have to. So he's just, I think he's coming in. The Mind and Its Function, which was taught by Geshe Rapton and I think translated by Stephen Batchelor. You know Stephen Batchelor, famous now, all these books that Stephen translated. This is very excellent also. And there's another text that we might be able to find that was printed at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives many years ago. Very short one on Lorig. It's just called The Ways of Knowing. And the author was a Tibetan Lama, Akyo Yongzen, one of the other great Tibetan yogi lamas. Very short, succinct, and there's a little commentary of Geshe Nawan Darge's there. You may be able to find that in your bookshelf if you've been to India, or you go over to John Landau's house, he must have it, because he was one of the co-translators. He finished up the English, so we have to find John. John Landau, Alex Berzin, Sharpa Tulku, and Kamalung Tulku translated that, The Ways of Knowing. So these are the different kinds of supplementary texts. Then also, just one last thing, if you're inclined toward the elaborate, you'd like to have as much weighty material, you can take a look at Jeffrey Hopkins' book, Meditation on Emptiness, which has a lot of other things in it, but has a lot of these things that we'll be talking about, in it. You can find that in the library. So let's finish up with a very short, brief today meditation and dedication. Relaxing the mind, relaxing the body. Bring your attention to your mental consciousness, and if there's any sense of dread or awe, not in the sense of fantastic awe, but oh my gosh, try to realize all of this is not difficult. Boys and girls, 13, 14 years old, by the force of familiarizing over a couple of weeks, begin to understand this. Certainly I can understand this. And think that due to the force of our meditation, our motivation at the beginning, and having kept concentration and tried to listen with attentiveness and open mind and contribute, we've created roots of merit, virtuous karma on our mind stream this evening. Let's dedicate that merit, which is a mental action, aspiring, mental factor aspiration, thinking, it should be, may these roots of merit ripen, not simply in some samsaric relief we call samsaric happiness alone. It definitely can only ripen that way. It as happiness in samsara at first, but let me dedicate it in such a way that until I achieve enlightenment, may it constantly nourish me like a perennial tree coming up again and again. Due to these merits, may I quickly attain the state of enlightenment, compassion, complete freedom from all doubts and confusion, happiness, bliss everlasting, compassion and wisdom for the welfare of all sentient beings. Okay, thank you very much. So hope, let's see how many people, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So next week we'll see how many courageous people there are. Thank you very much. There's still some cookies and stuff left. I think if you have a chance to continue, you won't regret it. This is something some of my teachers have said. You can do a whole retreat of Vajrasattva. You could spend years doing Vajrasattva retreat, but in one semester, one term of studying tenets or some subject like this, you can create more merit. Because without knowing what to meditate about, without understanding the vital point, like we were talking in the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, how to understand emptiness, how to develop bodhicitta, you're going to be flailing around and never getting there.